All right, so this is question 5 of 11.2. We're working with paired data still, we can tell because it talks about that we're looking at water clarity in the same length and lake, so that means that it's a dependent data sample. And if it's dependent, then we're going to be using paired data crunch. First, it talks about why it's important to take measurements on the same date, and that would be this one right here. Using the same dates make the second sample dependent on the first. That word dependent is our key. That's why we do it on the same date, because we want to make sure that if there is a difference, we actually find it. So now it's asking us to, we're starting to get into our hypothesis test, and we got to identify the null and alternative. So we were talking about means. The mean difference is going to be equal to 0, because if there's no difference between the means, then that means between our sample sets, oops, I guess it's right there, then if we minus them from each other, it would be a 0. So that's why we use 0. And then we're looking to see if the clarity of the lake is improving. And so we have to think about this, think twice about this, because we see if it's improving and we can't just jump to conclusions if that's greater than or less than, because we have to think that we're subtracting the initial depth minus the depth in 5 years. And so if it's improving, this number should be higher. And so if the number is higher that we're subtracting, then it's supposed to be a negative. If you got lost in that, let me explain it a little bit better. So if we're talking about depth, and let's say the first year, I'll just make up some numbers. The first year we could see 10 feet deep, and the second year we could see 20 feet deep. If we can see 20 feet deep versus 10, that means it's going to be clearer, right? And so if we do 10 minus 20, that equals negative 10, which is less than 0. And so I know it's tempting to see if it's improving. You think, oh, if it's improving, then it's going to be greater than 0, but we're talking about differences where we subtract the x from the y. It says right there. And so we're going to use the less than sign. Okay, now we're going to run the test. So let's open this up in StatCrunch. And we're talking about paired, and t-stats is the only paired, and we're talking about the mean as well, so we're going to be in t-stats. Sample 1 is always the x, sample 2 is always the y. I'm just going to click this just for safekeeping, and then we want to make these identical, so equal, and then this one needs to be less than. So the t-stat is the test statistic. The p-value is right there. I gotta make sure I don't need to round more. Okay, now we're talking about sorry. So our p-value is 0.835, and the our level of significance is at, let's see, where does it say? Okay, 0.5. And so it looks like that. So we're not going to reject the null hypothesis because there's not sufficient evidence to conclude that it is improving. So now we're going to draw a box plot of the difference data. Whoops. So how we're going to do that in StatCrunch is this column, when we were finding the test statistic and the p-value, we clicked on a box that said show differences. And that's what this is. The show differences is the x minus the y, and that's what it's asking us to graph. And so we're going to go into graph, and it's asking us to do a box plot. So we'll click on box plot and differences. So there's that. And so you just find the one that closely matches that. So we're going to go to almost -3, almost to 3, or 6, I mean. So it looks like it's going to be this one right here. That one looks the closest to me. So the closest our differences are to 0 means the less change. And so it's asking if it supports it. And if we look at our box plot, this big part, if you remember the box plot, this represents the median. And this is Q1, Q3, right? And so this is half, the middle half of all of our data is right here, which is pretty close to 0. And so we're going to say, yes, it does support that the lake is not becoming more clear since most differences are positive or near 0. And that is how you do question 5.